Okay. My name is Orland Hartford. I'm a operating engineer, and I was hired by Thomas-Elgin to work in the powerhouse as assistant chief engineer. And as such, I worked days on 1 day a week. I worked 2 night shifts, 2 afternoon shifts, and a day shift. And in our powerhouse, we had some large boilers, 2 quite old chain grate Leonard boilers that were fed with natural draft. And then we had a newer boiler, a big 500 horsepower combustion engineering stoker fired water tube boiler. The reason for the boilers was to provide steam heat through all the buildings, including the station on the other side of the tracks. That's now where all the entertainment hall is held. And we had in the powerhouse, we had a cordless horizontal steam engine that operated a 400 kilowatt, 25 cycle 400 kilowatt generator. And during that time, it was when they changed from 25 cycle to 60 cycle. And the buildings here were changed starting at the west and coming east. They would take the electric motors all down and put on the 26 and the 60 cycle, and they came eastward through the plants. And at that time, the roundhouse was still open and operating. So all the buildings were here at that time. And so we operated the generator during the day and provided 25 cycle, and as they moved through the buildings, changed to 60 cycle, and that was a couple of years at least. And so I worked here 2 years, is really what I worked here. And but I had an incident with Tommy Cottrell coming to the powerhouse one day in the fall. As I say, I was assistant chief engineer, and I was on the day shift in charge. That was his day off. So Tommy said, we got to have heat over in the office. The girls are cold and we need steam. Well, I said, nothing is together. It's all shut down for the summer and it's not put back together. He said, well, put it back together. So I said, well, we're not allowed to do that work. They have to get the guys from the other mechanics department to put the boiler back together. And I've called them and they'll be coming soon, but we don't know just how long it'll be. He said, what about those other boilers? Oh, I said, we won't have too much luck with them. We have to pile wood in them and coal and light them up and start to get them going. But I said, well, he said, do it, get them going. I said, well, I can wait for this. He said, just get them going. So we got together, I got my helper, and we did get them going. We had the fires in them, and they were working as hard as they could, but we weren't getting much heat in a hurry. So in the meantime, they came and connected up the high-speed boiler, you might call it that, the one that had an automatic stoker on it. But everything was cold in those days. Even the cars used to come right in and into the storage area in the powerhouse. And then the coal was conveyed up and came down into the chutes to pass into the boiler and make the steam. So at any rate, I done this Tommy wanted, and about 12 o'clock noon I cracked this heat over to the station, and they of course could hear the steam coming on, and by 1 o'clock Tom come back and said, well, I guess you got everything going. He said, you get those old ones going? I said, yeah, I got about 40 pounds per on them. He said, well, you got 125 on this new one. Oh, yes, I said. Then we got that going, and didn't take long. We got her up, and that's how we got the heat over there in such a hurry. And I suppose he wasn't in there till 9 o'clock. But anyway.
What years was this occurring?
1956.
1956. And what year were the change? This is when the changeover occurred from the 25 to 60 cycle.
Right.
In those years.
Right. 1956, 57. They probably finished in 58. And anyway, he was quite pleased, and that I had got everything going, and people had heat, and people were happy. It does when you happen to be doing that type of thing. Well, that was mostly what we did there, was operate that generator to provide the 25 cycle for the changing. And so we just operated as usual. And
so this was so help me understand a bit. When they switched to the 60 cycle, they're then going on the grid electricity, and but prior to that, the electricity was it all generated on site for the yard?
It was during the change. It was fed from the outside before that.
Oh, before that, and then
yeah.
But then
they disconnected the 25 cycle and hooked it into the powerhouse. And then the 60 cycle, of course, was fed from the energy place. Anyway, so that pretty much was what we did there. And of course, I say that was over a period of 2 years. And there weren't too many things that happened. I was the shift engineer in charge, whatever shift I was on, and we had a helper with the third-class engineered papers. So there was two of us on shift all the time, 24 hours a day. And that was pretty much normal.
Yeah, tell me more about the shifts. How long were they? And they seem to change all the time. So explain a bit more about the shifts.
Because I was assistant chief, I worked the unusual shift, shall we say. 2 nights, 2 afternoons, and 1 day. But the normal shift were 8 hours, 8 to 4, 4 to 12, and 12 to 8. And there was 2 guys on all those shifts. So there was quite a few engineers working there. And I don't remember too many names. Gord Doan was one that I knew personally pretty well. And but the chief, I don't remember his name.
What was your, how did you come to get that job on the railroad?
Oh, okay. Well, I had started in London as an operating engineer, and the way it goes is you become a 4th class engineer first, and then if you write the exams, you can become a 3rd class engineer, and with 5 years experience in passing the exams, you could become a 2nd class engineer, and with 10 years experience in the proper sized plants, you can write your 1st class engineer's papers, and today I'm a 1st class engineer, retired. So I had come from London to Port Stanley and started the plant up for Joe McManus, delivering bunker oil to the hospitals and other places around here. I remember the drivers went from there to Tillsonburg, London, Clinton, and so on, delivering oil. That's where I came from. And then I quit working for Joe. We couldn't agree on a couple of things. And I went to the psych hospital. And while I was there, I worked on a ship as an assistant to a second-class engineer. I was a third. Well, while I was there, I got my second-class papers. And they must have advertised for a second-class engineer here to work in the powerhouse. So I applied and was hired in October the 16th, 1956. And I spent 2 years here. That's a bit of a story about how the second-class engineers were dismissed here and laid off, shall we say. And I ended up working for the federal government in London. And so that's kind of the history of what I did. And I lived in St. Thomas, of course. So I commuted for a couple of years with the federal government to London, RCAF Crumlin. And I said specifically to my wife one day, I guess somebody will have to die in this city because there's only 3 engineers here, one at the hospital, one at the Timkins, I think, and one other factory had an engineer's second class. So coincidentally, the fellow at the St. Thomas-Elgin General Hospital died, and I applied and was hired. And so I ended up working there. And I got my first-class engineer's papers while I started there. However, that's kind of away from the Michigan. But anyway, the powerhouse was located on Wellington Street, right where a lot of Cook's offices are today. And when it was shut down, they closed it down, and they closed different buildings around here and started tearing them down. Gord Coleman, the junk man, got to tear down the powerhouse. And he used to smile and say, I told you I'd get it, Hartford. I told you. So he tore it down. I don't know whatever happened to it. And I don't know, I don't imagine there was anything left around that was in the powerhouse. I assume that perhaps there are some pictures or something that were taken. But it was quite an interesting place, and it was part of the buildings that were all around here. Even the roundhouse was still here at that time. So,
was the roundhouse electrically powered?
Yeah, well, there was lighting and so on.
So it was just, I meant the actual turntable. How was the turntable powered?
I think it must have been electric. Yeah.
As I know the C&O one was, so
yeah.
That one was too, and I wondered if that was part of what you were powered. But I mean, you're just running the generator where the wires go. That's not your business.
Right. Right.
I have a few questions that have been brought up by that, and I don't mind straying a little bit. I'd like to know. You said there was a bit of a story of the second-class engineers being dismissed. I would love to hear that story.
Well, I think I might have been at fault for that. I was reading the Operating Engineers Act, and it said in the Act that the railroads were not covered under the Act. So they didn't need second-class engineers. They didn't need anybody with papers. If a guy didn't have papers, but he knew what to do, they could have had him operating the boilers. Well, I suspect that I may have told someone, because after a few months after, or a short time after I discovered that, they decided they could hire third-class engineers to do the work and pay them a lot less than they were paying us guys. So the second-class engineers were laid off, and the third-class fellows operated the boilers. It was getting close to the end, and so we had to go out and find jobs. And I don't remember. I think Gord went to Psych Hospital in London. That's about the only one I remember. I went with the federal government, and ended up back in St. Thomas and spent 27 years at the St. Thomas-Elgin General Hospital as the chief engineer and in charge of all the operations.
Tell us just a bit about that, about the chief engineer at the hospital for those years, and what years those were.
Yeah, well, I came there in December the 1st, 1959, and I was the chief engineer, but I was also the engineering director, or the director of engineering. So I was in charge of not only the powerhouse there, but the maintenance, painting, the groundskeeping. I worked at overall everything. At times I had as many as 12, 15 guys working for me all the time. I had 20 when I left back in 96. So that worked pretty good.
And another thing that you brought up, I'd like to hear more about the fuel depot in Fort Stanley. If you tell us where it was mostly a truck depot, or is it?
It was a truck depot.
And tell us first of all, explain. We know who Joe McManus was, but explain
Yeah.
the future, what this operation was, the name of it, and
Yeah.
what it was, where it was positioned.
Well, sure. It was Sterling Fuels. It was Imperial Oil, or no, the coal dock, which that was Imperial Fuels, I guess. And then he bought the Shell plant on the way to the beach on the other side of the river. And he changed and revamped the Shell plant and built a powerhouse there. And he imported 2 boilers from somewhere. They were old boilers, and put them in there and had them built up. And then he called me. Well, he came to my house really in London and hired me to run the place in Port Stanley. Well, that was a challenge for me, so I took it. Shipping heavy bunker oil. It was boated in to the docks and pumped into the tanks. And the business went so well, and I guess it was profitable, because they didn't share that quite with me, but we built a $1 million storage tank there. It's still there today, those tanks. The people who make asphalt, they run the place now. It's an asphalt plant. And those things are all there now. But just that Joe McManus had built Sterling Fuels. And those days, they shipped by rail as well out of Port Stanley. So.
Yes, those tanks were served by the. If we could try to, if I get you to go back and talk about that, the shipment of oil, coal, and such from Port Stanley.
Yes, well, when I was hired from London as the operating engineer to work for Sterling Fuels in Port Stanley, at that time, Joe McManus had started Sterling Fuels. He'd just taken over the old Shell plant on the west side of the harbor there. And we used to have ships coming in from Sarnia, particularly. I think there was some coming from Montreal too, with heavy crude oil. And it had to be heated, but it was used for heat in boilers. It was automatic. Well, I've forgotten some of the details, but anyway, they sprayed the oil into the boilers, burnt heavy bunker oil. And so while I was there, we also built an additional storage tank, which is still on that site, where McAsphalt now operate store. But at that time, and during my time there in Port Stanley, there were railroad tracks back into the west side of the dock of the creek, and coal was loaded in rail cars with a steam crane at that time, and because my friend worked on it, Huey Hyatt, and anyway, they were shipped out of there into London, wherever, and bunker oil was also shipped out of Port Stanley by rail. So there was quite a bit of connection there with coal on both sides of the creek that were connected to fuel. Imperial Fuels on one side, Stirling Fuels, and Century Coal on the other side. And those rails on the Century side were shipped several carloads at a time, is what I remember. And so there was that connection. They came up the line from Port Stanley. So that's been my experience with the railroad, I guess you could say. And yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, or?
Well, not other than time progressed, and like I said, I became a first-class engineer, director of engineering at the hospital, and I was there for 27 years. And so I've had a great time in St. Thomas. So I guess when you tell the story what I told, some people will be smiling and will remember some of the things, like the rail cars going through St. Thomas.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, one thing I might mention, Tommy Cottrell was the master mechanic here at that time. Well, years passed, and I had a call when I was working at the hospital. There was somebody a patient upstairs that wanted me up there. So I went up to see who it was. Tommy Cottrell, I believe he was 95, and he was the patient. So he said, Orland, he said, you know I got you this job, don't you? So I guess I got a good reference from Tommy that I mentioned earlier, because we kind of renewed our acquaintance, and he died about a year later or so. But he was not bad health for 95. So, but we were, the way our connection was, he became friendly to me after that. Yeah. It kind of pleased him when I done better than he expected. So that was kind of a thing that happened later on. So anyway, that's my story. I'm sticking to it.